Frank was 65 years old and had been working at the same diner for 30 years. Nobody knew his past until that night when lives were on the line and his real training came to light. Welcome to the Hidden Stories. Before we begin this intense story of hidden skills and life-saving courage, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who've served in ways we never knew. Frank Martinez had been pouring coffee at Mel's Diner since 1994. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., he'd unlock the glass doors, flip the sign from closed to open, and begin the same routine he'd perfected over 3 decades. At 65, Frank moved with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that consistency mattered more than speed. Regular customers knew they could count on him for strong coffee, a genuine smile, and service that never wavered. He remembered everyone's order, asked about their families, and somehow made a small-town diner feel like home. "Morning, Frank," said Officer Martinez as he slid into his usual booth. "The usual?" "Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast," Frank replied, already reaching for the coffee pot. "How's Maria doing with her nursing classes?" "She's doing great, thanks for asking." This was Frank's world, predictable, peaceful, ordinary. He wore the same white apron every day, kept his graying hair neat, and moved through the diner like a man who'd found his place. Nobody questioned why a man his age was still working tables instead of enjoying retirement. Nobody asked where he'd come from before Mel's Diner. The town of Cedar Falls, Colorado, had adopted Frank as one of their own long ago. He was just Frank the waiter, reliable, friendly, and unremarkable in every way that mattered to daily life. But on this particular Tuesday evening in October, everything was about to change. Tuesday nights were usually quiet at Mel's. The dinner rush ended by 7, leaving Frank with a handful of regulars and the occasional traveler passing through on Highway 34. Tonight was no different, or so it seemed. At 8:15 p.m., Frank was refilling coffee for Martha Henderson, the town librarian, when she mentioned the news. "Did you hear about those bank robberies in Denver?" Martha asked, stirring sugar into her cup. 3 banks in 2 weeks. They're saying it's the same group." Frank nodded politely. "Terrible thing. More coffee?" "The news said they're armed and extremely dangerous, moving through small towns now, hitting local banks." Martha lowered her voice. "Sheriff thinks they might be heading west on the highway." Frank's hand remained steady as he poured, but something shifted in his posture, so subtle that Martha didn't notice. His eyes swept the diner's interior with a different focus, cataloging exits and sightlines with the unconscious precision of someone trained to assess threats. "I'm sure we're safe here," Frank said calmly. "Cedar Falls isn't exactly a high-value target." At that moment, the bell above the door chimed, and 4 men walked in. They looked tired, road-worn, the kind of travelers who'd been driving too long and eating gas station food. Frank glanced over with his usual welcoming expression, but his trained eye caught details others would miss. The first man, tall, lean, nervous energy, kept his right hand inside his jacket. The second scanned the room like he was memorizing faces. The third positioned himself with a clear view of both the front door and the kitchen entrance. The fourth stayed by the door. "Evening, gentlemen," Frank called out with practiced hospitality. "Grab any seat you like, I'll be right with you." But Frank's mind was already shifting into a different mode, accessing training that had been dormant for decades. The 4 men took the corner booth, a tactical choice that Frank recognized immediately. They ordered coffee and burgers, speaking in low voices while their eyes continuously scanned the diner. Frank served them with the same cheerful professionalism he showed everyone, but every instinct he'd spent years suppressing was now on high alert. At 8:45 p.m., the diner held 6 customers: Martha the librarian, Tom Brennan reading his newspaper, young couple Jessica and Mike sharing a piece of pie, elderly Mr. Peterson finishing his meatloaf, and the 4 strangers. Frank was wiping down the counter when he heard the first man speak into a small radio. "Location secure. No complications visible." That's when Frank knew. "Excuse me," Frank said, approaching their table with coffee pot in hand. "More coffee for anyone?" The leader looked up and Frank saw what he'd suspected. Eyes that had seen violence, hands that moved with practiced efficiency, the alert stillness of men accustomed to danger. "We're good," the man said curtly. Frank nodded and turned away, but not before noticing the outline of weapons beneath their jackets. His mind began calculating. 4 armed men, 6 innocent civilians, multiple exit points, limited cover. At 8:52 p.m., everything went sideways. "Nobody move!" The leader's voice cut through the diner's comfortable quiet as all 4 men stood simultaneously, weapons drawn. "Everyone stay calm and nobody gets hurt," screams erupted from Martha and Jessica. Tom's newspaper fell to the floor. Mr. Peterson froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. The atmosphere that had been peaceful seconds before now crackled with terror. "Hands where we can see them," shouted the second gunman. "Face down on the floor. Now!" Frank slowly raised his hands, but his mind was moving at combat speed. 4 hostiles, semi-automatic pistols, organized movement patterns. This wasn't their first time. As civilians dropped to the floor in panic, Frank's 30 years of carefully maintained cover began to dissolve. Muscle memory that had been suppressed since 1994 started reasserting itself. His breathing remained controlled. His hands stayed visible but ready. His feet found their foundation in a stance that looked casual but provided optimal mobility. Decades of Special Forces training doesn't disappear. It just waits. "You," the leader pointed at Frank. "Old man, empty the register." "Of course," Frank replied, his voice steady. "No problem at all." He moved toward the cash register with the slow, compliant shuffle of a frightened senior citizen, but his eyes were mapping the room, calculating angles, timing the gunman's movements. 30 years ago, Frank Martinez had been Staff Sergeant Francisco Martinez, 5th Special Forces Group. 18 years of active duty, 3 combat deployments, specialized training in close quarters, combat, hostage rescue, and counter-terrorism operations. He'd retired in 1994 and chosen the quiet life deliberately. Cedar Falls represented everything his military service had been designed to protect: small-town America, innocent people living peaceful lives, the freedom to feel safe in ordinary places. But tonight, his 2 worlds were colliding. "Hurry up," the second gunman snapped, pressing his weapon against Martha's head. She sobbed quietly, too terrified to speak. Frank's hands moved slowly over the register keys, but his mind was in full tactical mode. Hostile 1. Leader, position center, commanding view. Hostile 2, securing civilians, weapon trained on librarian. Hostile 3, covering the kitchen, blocking rear exit. Hostile 4, front door, escape route control, standard hostage situation protocol. Frank had trained for this exact scenario dozens of times. $347, Frank announced, holding up the cash. "That's all there is." "Bullshit," Hostile 1 snarled. "There's gotta be more." "Tuesday nights are slow," Frank explained patiently. "Most folks pay with cards these days." The leader's frustration was evident. This wasn't the score they'd expected. Frank recognized the signs: desperation making them sloppy, time pressure causing mistakes. "Check the safe," Hostile 1 ordered. "There isn't one," Frank replied truthfully. Mel never saw the need for one in Cedar Falls. Frank was slowly positioning himself, using his movement around the register to improve his tactical position. To the gunman, he looked like a compliant old man, but he was calculating distances, identifying improvised weapons, and waiting for the right moment. "Please," whispered Jessica, the young woman, "we have a baby at home. Please don't hurt us." The emotional pressure was affecting Hostile 2. Frank could see his grip on the weapon becoming less steady. Stress and adrenaline were working against the gunman's training, if they had any. "Everyone shut up," Hostile 3 shouted from the kitchen entrance. "We need to move." Frank realized they weren't planning to leave witnesses. This wasn't just robbery. These men were prepared to kill everyone in the diner to protect their escape. That changed everything. For 30 years, Frank had been content to let that part of his life stay buried. But watching Martha sob in terror, seeing the young couple clutch each other, watching Mr. Peterson shake with fear, something inside Frank Martinez clicked back into place. Staff Sergeant Francisco Martinez, 5th Special Forces Group, was back on duty. "I need to get something from behind the counter," Frank said to Hostile 1. The cash bag with the rest of the money. Make it fast. Frank moved with deliberate slowness, his aged appearance masking the predator's calculation happening behind his eyes. Behind the counter, his hand found the heavy glass coffee pot, 12 inches long, 3 pounds when full, perfect for close-quarters combat. Hostile 2 was still focused on Martha, his weapon wavering slightly due to stress. Hostile 3 remained by the kitchen, but his attention was divided between the back exit and the main room. Hostile 4 was checking the parking lot through the front window. Perfect. Frank had learned long ago that successful operations depended on timing, positioning, and the element of surprise. Right now, he had all 3. Found it, Frank called out, lifting the cash bag with his left hand while palming the coffee pot with his right. Coming back now. He moved toward Hostile 1 with the shuffling gait of an old man, but every step was precisely calculated. Distance, 8 feet, target's weapon pointed downward, backup targets identified and prioritized. About time, Hostile 1 muttered, reaching for the cash bag. That was his mistake. What happened next took 15 seconds and changed 6 lives forever. Frank Martinez vanished, and Staff Sergeant Francisco Martinez took his place. In one fluid motion, Frank dropped the cash bag and swung the coffee pot in a perfect arc that connected with Hostile 1's wrist. The sound of breaking bone echoed through the diner as the gunman's weapon flew across the room. Before the first gunman hit the ground, Frank was already moving. 30 years of suppressed muscle memory exploded into action as he pivoted toward Hostile 2, who was turning away from Martha in confusion. Frank's left hand clamped down on the second gunman's weapon, controlling the muzzle direction while his right elbow drove into the man's solar plexus. The gunman doubled over, gasping, as Frank stripped the weapon from his hands with textbook precision. "Everyone stay down," Frank commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. Hostile 3 was raising his weapon when Frank's first shot, controlled, precise, non-lethal, caught him in the shoulder and spun him around. The gun clattered across the kitchen floor. Hostile 4 spun from the window, weapon coming up, but Frank was already moving. Years of close-quarters combat training guided his steps as he used the counter for cover while closing distance. The fourth gunman fired twice, wild shots that shattered coffee cups but missed their target. Frank's return shot was surgical, striking the man's shooting hand and ending the threat. 15 seconds, 4 armed men neutralized, 0 civilian casualties. The diner fell silent, except for the groaning of wounded gunmen and the quiet sobbing of traumatized customers. Frank stood in the center of the diner, weapon trained on the 4 disabled gunmen, his breathing controlled and steady. But the faces staring at him weren't looking at Frank the waiter anymore. Martha Henderson, town librarian, was staring at a man she'd known for 30 years, who had just moved with the lethal precision of a trained killer. Tom Brennan's newspaper lay forgotten as he watched Frank efficiently secure weapons and check the gunman for additional threats. "Frank?" Martha whispered. Who are you?" Frank's hands moved automatically, performing tactical tasks while his mind processed the situation. His cover was blown. His quiet life was over. But 6 innocent people were alive. "Martha, I need you to call 911, Frank said calmly, his voice carrying new authority. "Tell them we have 4 suspects down, requesting medical assistance and law enforcement response." "Frank," Tom said, his voice shaking, where did you learn to do that?" Frank looked at the faces around him, people who had been his friends and neighbors for 3 decades, now seeing him as someone completely different. "A long time ago," Frank said quietly, "before I came to Cedar Falls." Mr. Peterson, still sitting in his booth, spoke with wonder in his voice. "Son, I was Marines in Korea. I've never seen anything like what you just did." Frank nodded respectfully. "Different time, different war, Mr. Peterson." Sirens were approaching in the distance. Frank methodically cleared and secured the weapons, checked each gunman for injuries, and began organizing the scene for law enforcement response. His movements were professional, efficient, automatic. The young couple, Jessica and Mike, clung to each other while staring at Frank with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. "You saved our lives," Jessica whispered. Frank's expression softened. "You're safe now. That's what matters." Sheriff Martinez arrived 7 minutes later with 2 deputies and an ambulance. As law enforcement secured the scene, Frank found himself answering questions he'd hoped never to hear again. "Sir, I need to see some identification," Deputy Carlson said. Frank handed over his Colorado driver's license. Frank Martinez, Cedar Falls address, born 1959. "This says you're Frank Martinez, but the way you handled those weapons—" "Sir, what's your background?" Frank took a deep breath. 30 years of carefully maintained cover was about to end. "Staff Sergeant Francisco Martinez, United States Army, 5th Special Forces Group, retired 1994, he said quietly. The deputy's eyes widened. Sheriff Martinez, no relation despite the shared name, stepped forward. "Special Forces? Green Beret?" "Yes, sir." "Combat experience?" 3 deployments, classified operations." Martha, who was giving her statement to another deputy, overheard and turned around. "Frank, in all these years you never said anything about military service?" Frank met her eyes. "That life was over, Martha." "I came to Cedar Falls to be Frank the waiter, not Staff Sergeant Martinez." Mr. Peterson struggled to his feet and walked over to Frank. The elderly Korean War veteran extended his hand with deep respect. "Brother, I don't know what operations you ran or where you served, but what you did tonight, that was something special." Frank shook the old Marine's hand. "Just did what needed doing, Mr. Peterson." "No," Mr. Peterson said firmly. "You did what only someone with your training could do. You saved all our lives." The story made the front page of the Cedar Falls Gazette. Local waiter reveals Special Forces past, stops armed robbery. But Frank had asked them to keep the details minimal. No photographs, no mention of specific military units or operations. The diner reopened 3 days later. Frank was back at work, wearing the same white apron, pouring the same coffee. But everything had changed. Customers looked at him differently now, not with fear, but with a kind of respectful awe. Word had spread through the small town. Frank Martinez wasn't just their friendly neighborhood waiter. He was a guardian who had been watching over them all along. "Frank," said Officer Martinez during his morning coffee run, "I've been thinking about what happened." "It's over," Frank replied, refilling his cup. "Everyone's safe, that's what matters." "But you could have been hurt. You could have been killed. Why did you risk it?" Frank paused, coffee pot in hand, looking around the diner at faces he'd been serving for 30 years. "This is my home," he said simply. "These are my people. Some things are worth fighting for." The bell above the door chimed, and 3 strangers walked in. Federal agents, Frank realized immediately. They approached with the careful respect of professionals recognizing one of their own. "Mr. Martinez, Agent Thompson, FBI. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the suspects." Frank nodded. "Of course. Coffee?" As he served the agents, Frank caught Martha watching him with new understanding in her eyes. She smiled and nodded, a gesture that said she was proud to know him, past and all. 2 weeks later, Tom Brennan approached Frank during the lunch rush. "Frank, my grandson is thinking about military service. Would you talk to him sometime?" Frank considered this. For 30 years, he'd kept that part of his life locked away. But maybe it was time to acknowledge that some experiences, even difficult ones, had value for the next generation. "Bring him by on Sunday," Frank said, "after the rush dies down." 6 months later, Frank was training 2 young veterans who had recently moved to Cedar Falls. Both had struggled to find work that felt meaningful after their military service. Frank had recommended them to Mel, and now they were learning the restaurant business. "The key," Frank told them as they practiced taking orders, "is treating every customer like they matter, because they do." "Frank," asked Sarah, a former Army medic, "do you ever miss it, the military life?" Frank thought about the question while wiping down tables. "I miss the brotherhood, the sense of purpose. But I found something different here, community, peace, the chance to serve in a different way." "But don't you feel like you're wasting your training?" Frank smiled. "Sarah, every skill I learned in the Army I use here. Situational awareness, leadership, staying calm under pressure, taking care of people. The uniform's different, but the mission isn't. That evening, as Frank locked up the diner, Sheriff Martinez stopped by. "Frank, I wanted you to know, those 4 suspects got 15 to 20 years each. Your testimony was crucial." "Good," Frank said. "They won't be hurting anyone else." "There's something else," the sheriff continued. "FBI says these guys were part of a larger operation. Your quick thinking probably prevented a lot more violence." Frank nodded, but didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the most important missions were the ones nobody talked about afterward. As he walked to his truck, Frank noticed Mr. Peterson sitting on the bench outside the diner, enjoying the evening air. "Evening, Mr. Peterson." "Frank, sit with me for a minute." The 2 veterans sat in comfortable silence, watching the peaceful streets of Cedar Falls. Finally, Mr. Peterson spoke. "You know, I've been thinking about that night, about what you did." "Ancient history," Frank replied. "No, it's not." Mr. Peterson turned to face him. "Son, I've lived in this town for 40 years. I've watched it change, seen good people come and go. But I've never seen anyone do what you did. Not just the fighting, but the choice to stay quiet about it all these years." Frank considered this. "I just wanted a normal life. And you earned it. But when the time came, you stepped up. That says something about who you are, not just what you were trained to do, but who you chose to be." They sat in silence as the sun set over Cedar Falls. Frank thought about the path that had brought him here, from the battlefields of classified operations to the quiet booths of Mel's Diner. 2 very different kinds of service, but both meaningful in their own way. "Mr. Peterson?" "Yes, son. Thank you for understanding." The old Marine smiled. "Warriors recognize warriors, Frank. Doesn't matter where we serve." A year later, Frank was featured in a Veterans Day article in the state newspaper. Not about the diner incident, that had been covered enough, but about his work with young veterans transitioning to civilian life. "Everyone assumes military skills don't transfer to civilian work," Frank told the reporter. "But leadership is leadership. Attention to detail is attention to detail. Taking care of people is taking care of people." The article mentioned that Frank had helped 7 veterans find meaningful work in Cedar Falls over the past year. It didn't mention his Special Forces background or the specifics of his service. Frank had requested that information remain private. "Some stories," he told the reporter, "are meant to stay quiet." But the article did mention something else. Frank had started a small nonprofit organization to help veterans transition to civilian careers. The name: Second Service Foundation. "The military teaches you to serve your country," Frank explained in the article. "But service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just changes form." The day the article was published, Frank received a call at the diner. "Is this Staff Sergeant Martinez?" "This is Frank Martinez," he replied carefully. "Sir, this is Captain Rodriguez, 5th Special Forces Group. I read the article. Sir, I wanted you to know. The unit remembers you. Your name is still on the wall." Frank felt something stir in his chest. Pride, brotherhood, connection to a past he'd thought was completely buried. "Thank you, Captain. That means a lot. Sir, if you ever want to visit, you'd be welcome. A lot of the younger soldiers could learn from your example." Frank looked around the diner, at Martha reading her morning paper, at Tom discussing baseball with the other regulars, at Mr. Peterson sharing war stories with a young veteran Frank had helped find work. "Maybe someday," Frank said, "but right now I've got work to do here." After he hung up, Martha approached the counter. "Frank?" That sounded important. "It was," Frank said, refilling her coffee. "But this is important too." Martha smiled. "You know, I never thanked you properly for that night." "No need to thank me, Martha." "Yes, there is. Not just for saving our lives, but for showing us what quiet courage looks like. You could have left Cedar Falls after your secret came out, gone somewhere new, started over again." Frank paused in his work. "Why would I do that?" "Because now everyone knows who you really are." Frank smiled. "Martha, I think you've got it backwards. For 30 years I was hiding who I really was. Now, for the first time, I get to be both Frank the waiter and Staff Sergeant Martinez. I don't have to choose anymore. The bell above the door chimed, and a young woman in military uniform walked in. She looked around uncertainly until she spotted Frank. "Excuse me, are you Frank Martinez?" "I am. What can I do for you?" "Sir, I'm Lieutenant Chen. I'm transitioning out of the Army next month, and Captain Rodriguez said you might be able to help. Something about second service?" Frank smiled and gestured to an empty booth. "Have a seat, Lieutenant. Coffee?" As he poured coffee for another veteran beginning a new chapter, Frank reflected on the strange path that had brought him to this moment. 30 years ago, he'd thought his service was ending. Instead, it had just been changing form. Some people serve in uniform, others serve in aprons. The best, Frank had learned, find ways to do both. This story was brought to you by The Hidden Stories. If you know a veteran whose service continues in unexpected ways, share their story in the comments, and subscribe to honor those who never stop serving even when nobody's watching.